This 1865 portrait of a black soldier looks triumphant until you notice his discharge paper. It seemed like everything a Civil War photograph should be. A young man in Union blue, shoulders squared, chin lifted. The war finally won. For decades, the image circulated as a symbol of liberation, of black men who had fought for their own freedom and survived to see it. Until a conservator in Virginia noticed something in the document the soldier holds in his right hand, something that turned triumph into evidence of a different kind of story altogether. Marcus Chen had been working in the conservation lab at the Virginia Historical Society for 11 years. He had handled thousands of Civil War-era photographs, everything from battlefield daguerreotypes to formal studio portraits of generals. He had seen images of black soldiers before, though they were rarer than the public might assume. Most archives held far more pictures of white officers than of the nearly 200,000 African-American men who served in the United States colored troops. So when an estate donation arrived from a family in Petersburg, and Marcus lifted a large albumin print from its acid-free sleeve, he felt the particular alertness that always came when something significant crossed his table. The photograph showed a soldier in full uniform. The brass buttons were polished. The kepi sat at a precise angle. The man's face was composed but not blank. There was something almost defiant in his expression, a directness that cut through the formal stillness of the pose. In his right hand, positioned carefully so the camera could capture it, he held a folded document. At first glance, it appeared to be his discharge paper. Marcus had seen this type of portrait before. Soldiers often posed with their discharges as proof of honorable service, a ticket back into civilian life, and for black soldiers, documentary evidence of their new legal status as free men. But something about the paper's visible text made Marcus pause. He adjusted his magnifying lamp and leaned closer. The print was remarkably sharp. The photographer had been skilled. And there, in the upper portion of the document, Marcus could make out 3 words that did not belong in a portrait of celebration. Surgeon's Certificate of Disability. He sat back. That was not a standard honorable discharge. That was a medical discharge, issued when a soldier was deemed unfit for further service due to injury or illness. It often meant reduced or withheld pay. It sometimes meant the soldier had been discharged before his enlistment was complete, which could affect his eligibility for a pension or bounty. And in some cases, Marcus knew, it meant something far worse. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written a name and a date. Corporal Elijah Saunders, 38th USCT, April 1865. The 38th United States Colored Troops. Marcus recognized the regiment. They had been recruited in Virginia, trained at Camp St. William Penn in Pennsylvania, and deployed to the Petersburg campaign in the final months of the war. Many of them had been formerly enslaved men from the same plantations they later helped to capture. Their service record was distinguished. Their casualty rate was brutal. Marcus stared at the photograph for a long moment. Elijah Saunders looked healthy. His posture was strong. His eyes were clear. If he had been discharged for disability, there was no visible sign of it. And yet he had chosen to pose with that document, to make it the centerpiece of his portrait. Why would a man display a paper that marked him as damaged? Unless, Marcus thought, the paper was not a mark of shame at all. Unless it was evidence of something the soldier wanted recorded, something he could not say aloud but could preserve in silver and salt. Marcus had been trained as a conservator, not a historian. His job was to stabilize fragile materials, not to interpret them, but he had learned, over years of handling objects that other people only saw behind glass, that sometimes the physical artifact held questions that the catalog description had never asked. He photographed the portrait at high resolution, front and back. He emailed the images to Dr. Lorraine Jeffers, a historian at Howard University who specialized in the service records of black Union soldiers. Her reply came the next morning. "Where did you find this? I've been looking for records of the 38th's medical discharges for 6 years. Call me." Marcus called. Dr. Jeffers explained that the 38th USCT had suffered an unusually high number of medical discharges in the final weeks of the war, not from battle wounds, but from a single outbreak that swept through the regiment in early April 1865. The official cause was listed as chronic diarrhea, a catch-all diagnosis that covered everything from dysentery to malnutrition. But the pattern was strange. Nearly 80 men were discharged in a 2-week period, all with the same diagnosis, all processed by the same surgeon. And unlike soldiers discharged for battlefield injuries, these men received no back pay, no bounty, and no pension eligibility. They were cheated, Dr. Jeffers said, systematically, but I've never been able to prove how, because the individual discharge papers were separated from the unit's records decades ago. Most of them are lost. Marcus looked at the photograph on his screen. This one isn't lost, it's right here. 2 weeks later, Marcus drove to Washington to meet Dr. Jeffers in person. She had arranged access to the National Archives, where the service records of the United States colored troops were stored. They spent 3 days pulling files, cross-referencing names, and slowly reconstructing the final weeks of the 38th Regiment. What they found was not a disease outbreak. It was a scheme. The surgeon who had signed Elijah Saunders' discharge was a man named Dr. Franklin Mayhew. He had been assigned to the 38th in February 1860, replacing a previous surgeon who had died of typhoid. Within weeks of his arrival, the rate of medical discharges in the regiment tripled. The diagnoses were almost identical: chronic diarrhea, debility, rheumatism, conditions that were impossible to verify and easy to fake on paper. Dr. Jeffers found a letter from a lieutenant in the 38th, written to the Bureau of Colored Troops in May 1865, complaining that healthy men were being turned out of service without explanation, and that the surgeon was acting on orders that do not appear in any regulation I have read. The letter had been filed and never answered. Then they found the contract. It was buried in a collection of plantation records from Dinwiddie County, Virginia, donated to the archives in the 1940s by a family that had made its fortune in tobacco. The contract was dated April 20th, 1865. It was a labor agreement between a planter named Charles Whitmore and a group of 63 freedmen, binding them to work his fields for a period of 1 year in exchange for room, board, and a small wage that would be paid at the end of the contract. The names on the contract matched almost exactly the names on Dr. Mayhew's discharge list. Elijah Saunders was the 14th name. Marcus felt the floor shift beneath him. He had seen labor contracts from this period before. They were common in the immediate aftermath of the war, when the federal government encouraged freed people to sign agreements with former slaveholders as a way of stabilizing the Southern economy. Some of these contracts were fair. Many were not. But this one was different. This one had been signed less than 2 weeks after the men had been discharged from the Army, and the witness signature at the bottom of the contract belonged to Dr. Franklin Mayhew. The surgeon had not been treating sick soldiers. He had been supplying a labor force. Dr. Jeffers leaned back in her chair. "This is peonage," she said quietly. "They discharged these men without pay, without bounties, without any means of supporting themselves, and then they funneled them directly onto a plantation. They didn't even let them go home first." Marcus thought of Elijah Saunders standing in that photographer's studio, holding his discharge paper for the camera. He had not been displaying a badge of honor. He had been documenting a crime. The studio where the portrait had been taken was identified by a small oval stamp on the back of the photograph, partially obscured by age. Marcus was able to make out the words J. Calloway and Petersburg. A search of city directories from the 1860s turned up a listing for James Calloway, a free black photographer who operated a studio on Sycamore Street from 1859 to 1871. Calloway's work was not well known, but he was mentioned in a few historical surveys of African American photographers, and a handful of his images survived in other collections. He had been one of the only black studio photographers in Virginia during the war. Dr. Jeffers found a brief article about Calloway in a Richmond newspaper from 1867. It described him as a colored man of some enterprise who had been instrumental in assisting freedmen with legal matters after the war. The article did not elaborate, but Dr. Jeffers had a theory. Photographers in this period were often notaries, she said. They witnessed signatures, certified documents, and kept records that could be used as evidence in court. If Calloway was helping freedmen with legal matters, he might have been documenting their cases. The portrait might not just be a portrait, it might be an affidavit. They began searching for other photographs from Calloway's studio. Over the next several months, they located 11 additional images scattered across archives in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. 8 of them showed black soldiers. All 8 were holding documents, and all 8 had been discharged from the 38th USCT in April 1865. One of the photographs, held by a private collector in Philadelphia, showed a man named William Graves. His discharge paper was clearly visible, and the diagnosis was the same: chronic diarrhea. But there was something else in the image. In his left hand, partially hidden by the folds of his coat, Graves held a second piece of paper. It took Marcus 3 days of digital enhancement to make out the text. It was a letter. The opening line read, "To the Bureau of Freedmen, I swear under oath that I was discharged against my will and without cause." Calloway had been building a case. The question was whether the case had ever been heard. Dr. Jeffers found the answer in the records of the Freedmen's Bureau office in Petersburg. In November 1865, a complaint was filed on behalf of 41 former soldiers of the 38th USCT, alleging that they had been fraudulently discharged and coerced into labor contracts. The complaint was accompanied by sworn statements from the soldiers and, crucially, by photographic evidence. The case was assigned to a bureau agent named Captain Thomas Reed. Reed's report, filed in January 1866, confirmed the fraud. He found that Dr. Mayhew had been paid by Charles Whitmore to discharge healthy soldiers so they could be pressed into labor. The contracts they signed were not voluntary, but were presented as their only option for survival after being stripped of their Army pay. Reed recommended that Mayhew be court-martialed and that Whitmore's contracts be voided. The recommendation was overruled. The regional director of the Freedmen's Bureau, a man named General Orlando Brown, wrote in his response that the disruption caused by voiding these contracts would exceed the benefit to the affected parties, and that the labor situation in Virginia requires stability above all else. He noted that the soldiers had, technically, signed the contracts. He declined to pursue charges against Mayhew or Whitmore. The case was closed. The men stayed on the plantation. Marcus read the report 3 times. He kept returning to the phrase, stability above all else. It was the same logic that had justified slavery itself, the same logic that would later justify convict leasing, sharecropping, and 100 other systems designed to keep black labor under white control. The Bureau had been created to help freed people, and here it was, choosing order over justice, choosing the comfort of planters over the rights of the men who had fought for the Union. Elijah Saunders had survived the war. He had documented the fraud. He had testified under oath, and none of it had mattered. When Marcus brought the full story to the leadership of the Virginia Historical Society, the reaction was not what he had hoped. The director, a woman named Patricia Langford, listened carefully and then asked how the society intended to present the photograph in its upcoming exhibition on Civil War memory. "We were planning to include it in the section on black soldiers," Marcus said. "But now I think it needs its own case, its own context." Langford frowned. "The section on black soldiers is already quite extensive, and this story is, well, complicated. There's a lot of documentation, a lot of names. I'm not sure visitors will be able to follow it." Dr. Jeffers, who had joined the meeting by phone, spoke up. "The documentation is exactly why this matters. We can show people the paper trail, the discharge, the contract, the Bureau report. It's not just a sad story. It's proof of how the system worked." "But the system is the federal government," Langford said. "The Freedmen's Bureau. That's the same institution we usually celebrate for helping former slaves. If we present this story the way you're describing, we're essentially saying the government was complicit in re-enslaving soldiers." "That's because it was," Dr. Jeffers said. The room went quiet. Marcus could see Langford calculating the risks. The society depended on state funding, private donors, and school group visits. Its exhibitions were supposed to be educational, but not inflammatory. A story about black heroism was easy to tell. A story about institutional betrayal was harder. "I'm not saying we hide anything," Langford said finally. "But I think we need to be careful about how we frame it. Maybe we focus on the photographer, the resistance, the fact that these men tried to fight back." "They did fight back," Marcus said, "and they lost. If we don't say that, we're lying." The debate continued for 3 more meetings. Dr. Jeffers flew in from Washington. A representative from the descendant community in Petersburg was invited to speak. His name was Ronald Saunders, and he was the great-great-grandson of Elijah Saunders. He had grown up hearing fragments of the story, passed down through generations, but he had never seen the photograph or the documents until Marcus contacted him. Ronald Saunders sat at the conference table with his hands folded in front of him. He was 74 years old. He had spent his career as a postal worker in Richmond. He said he had always known that something had happened to his ancestor after the war, something that had kept him poor and landless for the rest of his life. But the family had never been able to explain it. My grandmother used to say that Elijah was a hero who got treated like a criminal, he said. She said the government owed him money that he never got. We always thought she was exaggerating. Turns out she was telling the truth. He looked at Patricia Langford. If you put this picture in a case and write a little card that says he was a brave soldier, that's not the truth. The truth is that he was stolen from. The truth is that the people who were supposed to protect him handed him over to the same man who used to own people like him. That's the story. If you can't tell it, don't put him in your museum at all. The exhibition opened 6 months later. The photograph of Elijah Saunders was displayed in a dedicated alcove, surrounded by reproductions of the discharge papers, the labor contract, the Freedmen's Bureau report, and Captain Reed's overruled recommendation. A video screen showed Dr. Jeffers explaining the scheme. A recorded statement from Ronald Saunders played on a loop. The wall text did not soften the story. It said that Corporal Elijah Saunders had served with distinction, had been fraudulently discharged, had been coerced into labor that resembled slavery, and had tried to seek justice through the federal government. It said that his case had been denied. It said that he had died in 1901, still in Virginia, still poor, still waiting for a pension that never came. The final panel asked a question. How many other photographs like this one are sitting in archives, misread as symbols of freedom when they are actually evidence of its denial? The exhibition drew more visitors than any Civil War show the Society had mounted in a decade. Several newspapers covered it. A documentary crew began filming, and 3 other archives contacted Marcus to say they had found similar photographs in their collections, soldiers holding papers that no one had looked at closely before. The photograph of Elijah Saunders had been taken to preserve a record. For 150 years, the record had been ignored. Now, finally, it was being read. But Marcus could not stop thinking about what Ronald Saunders had said. His grandmother had known. The family had always known. The story had never been lost. It had just been kept in a different kind of archive, one that the institutions had not thought to consult. There is a category of Civil War photograph that historians call the triumphant freedman image. It shows a black man, often a soldier, posed with symbols of his new status, a uniform, a rifle, a document. The images were meant to circulate, to prove that the war had changed something, that the nation had made progress. But the images were also sometimes something else. They were evidence created by people who had no other way to make their voices heard. They were acts of documentation by men who knew that the law might fail them, that the Bureau might betray them, that the planter might win. They posed with their papers not because they trusted the system, but because they did not. They gave themselves to the camera because the camera, at least, could not lie. Elijah Saunders looked triumphant in his portrait. He wore his uniform like armor. He held his paper like a weapon. And maybe that is exactly what it was. Not a discharge, not a certificate, not proof of disability, but a piece of evidence, smuggled out of a rigged system and hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see what it really said. There are thousands of photographs like this one, in museum drawers and family albums and boxes in church basements. Each one is a surface that looks simple until you learn to read what lies beneath. The hands that are folded a certain way, the objects that are held but not explained, the expressions that do not match the occasion. Each one is a question that was asked a long time ago. The people who asked it did not know if anyone would ever answer, but they asked it anyway. They sat for the camera and they held up their evidence and they waited. They are still waiting.